It is one of the world's most strategically vital trade routes. The Strait of Hormuz is controlled in the north by Iran. And in response to US strikes, the state has threatened to close it. So, will Iran go ahead? And if so, what would that mean for the world economy? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, 1/5 of the world's oil supply is shipped through the Strait of Hormuz every day. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has warned it would be economic suicide to close the narrow shipping lane. So, why is the Strait of Hormuz so important? And what impact would it have on Europe and global oil prices if it was blocked?
Iran's response to the US attack on its nuclear facilities. Missiles were launched at America's airbase in Qatar. Doha successfully intercepted the ballistic weapons.
The state of Qatar condemns in the strongest terms the Iranian missile attack on the Qatari Al Udeid airbase. This attack represents a flagrant violation of Qatar's sovereignty and contravenes the principles of good neighborliness and an assault on international legitimacy and international law.
But Tehran has vowed everlasting consequences for the US.
In accordance with the UN Charter and its provisions allowing a legitimate response in self-defense, Iran reserves all options to defend its security, interests, and people.
Another of its options is closing the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important oil shipping routes. The Strait of Hormuz lies between Iran and Oman in the Arabian Gulf. The narrow shipping lane transports around 20 million barrels of oil per day from the Middle East. That's the equivalent of 20% of the global daily oil consumption. The Iranian government has approved its closure, and the threat is unsettling Europe.
Ministers are very much focused on the diplomatic solution and also the concerns of retaliation and this war escalating are huge. Especially closing of the Strait of Hormuz by Iran is something that it would be extremely dangerous and not good for anybody. Of course, we are discussing Middle East in broader sense, also after also Gaza and Article 2 of association agreement with Israel. We have done the review. The review is ready. All the member states have it, and we will discuss further. What to read out of this and what will we do with this.
Any disruptions to the flow of liquefied natural gas would hugely affect global oil prices and destabilize energy security. The EU is far more reliant on the Middle East after reducing the amount of gas from Russia following its war in Ukraine. It's a shift that has increased exposure to geopolitical shocks. So what would happen if this key strategic route were to close?
Well, let's meet today's guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C., we have Elisabeth Braw. She is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I'm delighted to say that here with me in the studio is Gaurav Sharma. He's an energy market analyst. And Ian King, the renowned British business journalist. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Gaurav, to you first of all. Iran has one very formidable weapon in its armoury, and that is geography, the Straits of Hormuz. Just explain to us why it is so important.
Look, and it's a crucial maritime artery. What we're looking at here is 1/5 of the world's crude, around about in the region of 20 million barrels per day. But if you amplify that to the wider energy spectrum, you've got about 20% of the world's LNG transiting through, you've got about 1/3 of the world's LPG transiting through. Now, convert all the gaseous stuff into barrels of oil equivalent, and you go somewhere in the region of 30 to 33 million barrels per day transiting through that narrow maritime artery. Whether Iran can shut it down or, in fact, wants to is a different matter. They've been saying since the 1980s that they'll do it, but they never really get around doing it.
Ian, if this were to pass, what would it do to energy markets everywhere, indeed consumers at the pumps in European countries?
Well, most people think that if Iran was to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, you'd probably be looking at $100 a barrel for crude. You'd probably be looking at, to translate that into the energy price cap in this country, in the UK, you'd probably be looking at north of £3,000, which is currently at around £1,600. It's not just, by the way, energy that travels through the Straits of Hormuz. Something like a fifth of the world's fertiliser and chemicals and minerals go through the Straits of Hormuz as well. So that has a knock-on effect on inflation more broadly everywhere. And going back to the point on Brent crude and the price of Brent crude, so $100 a barrel for Brent crude. I mean, we've been there before. We've been there in the not too distant past. But consider this: every $10 a barrel on Brent crude translates roughly to around 1/4 point on inflation in developed countries. So it's a tax on growth, effectively.
So no country in Europe will want to see anything happening to the Straits of Hormuz because it affects every single one of us?
Absolutely not. And there are certain countries that are particular, as Gaurav was saying, he talked about LNG, liquefied natural gas, going through the Straits as well. I mean, there are certain points in Europe that are big consumers of imported LNG. Italy is a country that comes to mind there.
Wow. Elisabeth, to you, just talk us through this huge choke point then. It really is a trump card, for want of a better phrase, for Iran, but they've never really played it, have they?
No, they haven't. And as Gaurav said, the threat has certainly been articulated by the Iranians a number of times. And indeed, the specter of them closing or blockading the Strait of Hormuz is one that always comes up whenever tensions flare up in the Middle East or in relation to Iran specifically. And yet, they always, the Iranian government always refrains from closing the Strait of Hormuz simply because it knows, just as we all do, how disastrous such a move would be, not just for global shipping and global oil transport in particular, but also for Iran's transport in and out of oil and other goods. So it would be yes, it would be a very powerful move, a crippling one for the international economy, for the globalized economy, but it would also cause great harm to Iran, not just in that moment, but to Iran's relations with other countries. No country wants to be seen as a country that harms the economies of its friends and allies and trading partners.
Gaurav, the phrase economic suicide was used the other day by Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State. This would be economic suicide for Iran, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. 90% of Iran's energy exports go to China. There is a caveat there. Most of them are sanctions-ridden. Some of them have severe restrictions, and the Chinese tend to buy them. Now, you cannot mess with your number one energy client in Beijing, because at the end of the day, if you blockade the strait, you will be hurting your number one energy partner, and you'll be terribly upsetting them because 50% of what goes from elsewhere in the region, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi, Qatar, quite a few of those petroleum products and petroleum and energy is heading China's way. So the Iranians cannot afford to upset Beijing.
Is there a school of thought, Gaurav, that, permit me to play devil's advocate here, a lot of these Gulf neighbours didn't exactly rush to Iran's defence over the last 12, 13 days?
Not at all. In fact, the recent events prove that they're actually quite frustrated with what's going on in the region. Of course, Israel launched the attack, not Iran, but they've been quite frustrated with what's some of the sound bites coming out of Tehran. There have been some modicum of peace between them. Diplomatic relations, etc., are solid. Oman's a good broker. The Qataris have been good brokers too, and they seem to be terribly frustrated with Iran.
Ian, if Iran were to do anything in the Straits of Hormuz, it would effectively be Iran versus the rest of the world, wouldn't it? Because as you point out, not just oil, gas, but fertiliser, the world needs that very small bottleneck.
Yeah, it would be a huge inflationary shock. So exactly what the West doesn't really want right now, given that growth is pretty sluggish in most developed economies right now. To some extent, we haven't really recovered from the shocks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. So it would be very, very troublesome indeed from that point of view. Real headache for the world's central bankers. I mean, one conspiracy theory I've heard, though, as to why they might do it, and this is where you get into the sort of diplomatic weeds, is really if the Iranians wanted to drag China into it and potentially corral China over to their side, they could turn around and say to the Chinese, well, look, we've had no choice but to do that. So that's a situation to watch. But yeah, essentially it would be Iran versus the rest of the world.
I mean, last week, the 10 days, just give us your reading of the markets and the impact of everything we've seen in the Middle East. How has it affected life in the financial centres you've been speaking to?
Well, it obviously had an impact on the crude price, first and foremost. You saw Brent crude flirting with sort of $80 a barrel. On Monday this week, when you got that sort of fairly muted Iranian response with the rocket launch on Qatar, you saw a big sell-off there because that was seen by the market as being sort of de-escalatory, Iran not really going full pelt at the US bases. And Brent crude on Monday sold off by 7.2%, which was the biggest one-day fall since August 2022. It continued to fall again on Tuesday. And in fact, by Tuesday afternoon, we were back to where we were prior to Israel's initial attack on Iran. That's partly the fact that there's a lot of oil out there.
So things have stayed pretty stable?
They have. You saw a reaction on equity markets. But again, the moment it looked like the situation was going to be de-escalated, equity markets were very benign. If you take, for example, the US equity markets on Monday evening, US time, when it was pretty clear that Iran wasn't really going to react in a very, very aggressive manner. Well, you saw the Dow, the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq all rise by around 1%. All of those are not far off their all-time highs.
Elisabeth, what would the United States do if Iran ever did anything in the Straits of Hormuz? How do you think the Trump administration would react?
It would certainly try to drum up diplomatic support for whatever action it would take against Iran. I think a good analogy is the tanker war in the 1980s. Now, it was launched by Iraq against Iran, but Iran, after some time, then retaliated and started attacking tankers associated with Iraq as well. So it was a proper tanker war, and some 450 attacks on oil tankers from the respective side took place, and it caused massive chaos and loss of life, considerable loss of life, so seafarers killed. But what the Americans did after a while was they began escorting American-flagged ships in these waters. And what then happened was that quite a few ships decided that it would be a good idea to flag in the United States, which they did. So we would probably see something like that, the United States escorting merchant shipping, American-flagged merchant shipping, possibly other ships as well, through the Strait of Hormuz. But again, I think it's unlikely that Iran would try to close the Strait of Hormuz, simply because it depends on shipping itself, and it would be suicidal to harm shipping. And on top of that, it, like all the other nations on this planet, knows that it's vital to allow merchant shipping to operate, because it's not just in the Strait of Hormuz that we depend on merchant shipping. We depend on merchant shipping being able to take place in every part of the world's oceans. And if seafarers, if shipping lines, if maritime shores can't have a reasonable assumption that they will be able to operate, then they will not. They will clearly no longer operate, and every country would suffer as a result.
Gaurav, you mentioned the sanctions earlier on. How important is that relationship then, China, for the Iranians?
Well, they're heavily dependent on Beijing to finance their way in life, in general, not just for military operations. And you see that gives China as much of a clout as the Indians have with Russian crude. So it's that powerful. So 1.65 million barrels per day is what Iran's producing, and 90% of that goes to China, discounted, of course. It's not at market rate. That's what the sort of anecdotal evidence is, and my personal sources tell me. So they're heavily reliant on China for a whole lot of things, and also there are payments in kind made by the sort of barter economy that bypasses the international finance system that the Iranians have come to rely on China. And the Iranians are also acutely aware that the Chinese have other sources of crude. There is a lot of non-OPEC crude out in the market from Guyana, from Brazil, from Canada, and let's not forget the United States. So the Chinese have alternatives, and that should spook all the policymakers in Tehran.
And Gaurav, you mentioned a discount. Just give us an idea of the kind of advantage China is pressing here when it comes to Iranian oil.
So you take on any given physical trading day, any given day in the spot markets, you're looking at discount of at least 12%, could be as high as 20%, especially at trying times like these for Iran.
And the Russians, where do they fit in? Do they take Iranian oil as well and gas, or?
Well, for Russia, it's more of a power broking game. If the troubles in Iran, the mischief, as they say, that Israel has caused, is more of a geopolitical disaster for Russia, because they've already lost Syria, they've already lost a bit of a hold in the region, and they don't want to lose Iran. As far as Russian crude goes, it primarily heads to India, but that also the US is intervening, is trying to curtail it. But there's a lot of discounted crude out there, and in some ways, that discounted crude from Russia and Iran actually competes out in the open market.
Ian, how much of a problem is this for big business then, that you have, 25 mile stretch at its widest point of water, so much energy and fertilizer and business going through there? I mean, the Iranians do have quite a significant card to play if they were to play it.
Well, we've seen this kind of disruption in the recent past, and you've seen cargo ships having to be diverted and travel up the west coast of Africa on a detour instead. And of course, that adds to journey times, it adds to costs, and all of those costs are ultimately met by consumers in one shape or form. Businesses may take a hit on their margins, but they'll try and pass those costs on to consumers, and that will be the case in this situation as well. And as I say, the fact that you've got all these big input costs, chemicals, fertilizers, LNG, crude, all of that ultimately, any increase in those costs ultimately finds its way onto the end consumer.
And tell me, Ian, are you surprised by what Gaurav just said about the Chinese discount there? Up to 20% they're taking off the price of oil just for doing business with the Iranians.
No, I'm not at all surprised, because, I mean, as Gaurav says, we've seen that with the way that the Russians have had to take heavy discounts on their crude when they're trying to get it out into the market as well. Under those circumstances, it's a buyer's market, and as the seller, you have to absorb these sort of discounts.
Gaurav, tell me, just looking at the geography of everything, what do you think would have to happen for the Iranian leadership to decide to play this card?
I think they've been talking about it since the mid-'80s, and at the height of various sort of infractions they've had in the past, they've not played that card. And I think precisely for the reason they know how much it's going to hurt them. Another thing is that the region itself, it's become like a broken record. It comes up every time. So if you look at some of the governments, they've taken mitigation measures, and among them, the topmost among them is the United Arab Emirates. So the Emiratis, what they've done is they've pulled a pipeline from Abu Dhabi to Fujairah, which bypasses the strait, and that has the capacity to take 75% of Emirati crude out of the region without the need for shipping. So there are things like these happening. For them to play this card, it'd be really, really sort of last days, very desperate stuff, and it looks highly unlikely.
Tell me, there's one school of thought, Ian, possibly a conspiracy theory online, that President Trump has played a very clever game here, because ultimately it might drive people towards everything that's been happening recently, might drive people towards buying more American oil. Is that a factor in his thinking?
Yeah, very possibly. I mean, America is an exporter of energy now, which is a relatively new situation, obviously, with the fracking, the shale boom. That's put America in this very, very powerful position. And indeed, we saw it after Russia attacked Ukraine. America rode to the rescue, where it looked as though Russian energy wasn't going to get into the wholesale market, and particularly bear in mind in parts of Europe, as I say, I mentioned countries like Italy, Hungary. These are countries that are very, very dependent on Russian energy, or were. Austria is another one. Well, the United States is in a very good position now to export more energy. LNG, for example, a lot of that, I mean, we get a lot of ours in the UK from Qatar. But the Americans are in a good position to ship that over. That's why, for example, Germany, which until Russia invaded Ukraine didn't actually even have any LNG terminals, well, now they do. So they're certainly an obvious buyer for American LNG.
Let's go back to Elisabeth. Elisabeth, just give us your thoughts on that. The line of thought that President Trump's policies and all of the harsh rhetoric, a lot of it has been about getting others to buy American oil.
I think it may be wishful thinking to assume that there was an ulterior strategy behind this. President Trump seems to have been changing his mind on a daily basis about how he was going to approach the conflict between Israel and Iran. And so to assume that there was a ground strategy behind it, I think is it is to perhaps give Trump more credit for the use of ground strategy than he deserves. But what he has done is clearly suggesting that America is a reliable source of energy when Iran may not be. But I think we should remember that Iran, in this whole situation, by not closing the Strait of Hormuz, has demonstrated that it knows the game. It knows that even though closing the Strait of Hormuz always seems like the most immediate and most effective action Iran can take, this time again, as of the 24th of June, it has not closed the Strait of Hormuz. And that suggests that it's going to act the way it has at every juncture in the past 40 years when it seemed obvious it was going to close the Strait of Hormuz and didn't. It knows that it would be so harmful to Iran itself. And these Iranian officials have been around for a long time. They are not new to this game.
Gaurav, just give me your thoughts on how easy it would be to close the straits if it came to it.
Look, I think they have the capabilities, definitely. And they can close it in a matter of 12 hours. They can basically, the only problem they have is that the element of surprise, they no longer have that, because there's heavy surveillance around the tip of Oman that's sandwiched between UAE territory, Musandam, which is in Omani territory, from where there's heavy monitoring activity. The other thing is the US Navy's Fifth Fleet is just a few hundred miles, nautical miles away in Bahrain, and they will be met with overwhelming firepower. And what that would mean is it's not just that the blockade could be very swiftly removed. It would have been enforced without, there'd be no element of surprise. And the Navy might then get a carte blanche, free license to attack pretty much every single Iranian port overlooking the Gulf. And that's why the stakes are very high. But yes, in theory, they can do it within a matter of hours, really.
12 hours, you reckon? And would they have to ask permission or cooperate with neighbours like Oman, or would they just go for it themselves?
Well, I suspect they can blockade it by themselves, despite the good relations they have with the Omanis. The one thing they might do or might not do, again, I said China is their #1 client, so they might have some kind of a coding system with China that will let your cargoes through, but will restrict the rest of the world. Some sort of a hypothetical scenario, but yes, they can close it in a matter of hours.
Ian, just looking ahead, the markets have calmed down. Everything seems to be calming down now. I'm guessing this is what big business wants, just back to normality.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at the sort of focus of big business prior to all of this, really, all of the conversations have been about when would the Federal Reserve cut interest rates, when will the Bank of England cut interest rates, when will the European Central Bank cut it? I mean, the European Central Bank have obviously been cutting pretty aggressively compared with one or two of their peers. You saw the Swiss National Bank cut interest rates to 0 last week. So we're in that sort of downward trend, and that was really what the focus for global business was. If you're a multinational, right, what is going to be the cost of borrowing over coming years? And obviously anything that's inflationary makes it much, much harder for central banks to cut rates, particularly the Fed, given that Trump has imposed tariffs and those are by definition inflationary as well. Really, really tricky. So businesses don't really like that sort of uncertainty. As I say, bear in mind the fact that every time you have cargoes diverted up the west coast of Africa, that adds to cost. It's very, very striking that actually, I mentioned what happened over the weekend, and you saw what happened to crude before things came off the boil on Monday of this week. Well, bear in mind, cargo rates have really, really gone up. I mean, I saw one figure in the Financial Times that said the cost of hiring a tanker, which was something like $18,000 earlier this year, had gone up to $78,000 earlier this week.
So who pays that?
That's
consumer
a cost
eventually?
Yeah, ultimately it'll be the consumer. All of these
us.
costs get passed on.
Ian, Gaurav and Elisabeth in Washington, D.C., thank you all so much for your insight on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.